Andy Gibb wasn't just another pop star, he was the golden boy of the late 70s. With a voice that could melt a room and a charm that seemed untouchable, he looked like the perfect package to millions of fans worldwide. But behind the spotlight, the youngest Gibb carried a story far more complicated than anyone imagined. And now, his brother Barry is finally pulling back the curtain. Young, gifted, and adored, Andy Gibb seemed untouchable. But behind the glittering image was a fragile soul, living a life far darker than the spotlight ever revealed. Even Barry, the brother who first helped raise him into fame, would later admit that Andy was nothing like the world imagined. That truth didn't just redefine Andy's legacy, it reshaped how the world would forever see the Gibb family. Barry Gibb's rise was legendary. His name is bound to the Bee Gees, a group that didn't just make hits, but rewrote the soundtrack of an era. As the eldest brother, Barry was more than a frontman, he was the architect, the guiding force who carried their sound through decades of shifting tides in music history. From tender ballads to the disco anthems that defined an entire generation, Barry Gibb carried an unmatched instinct for reinvention. But behind the awards, the fame, and the spotlight, his life carried a weight of complexity few ever saw. He wasn't just a legend in his own right, he was the one who ushered his youngest brother, Andy Gibb, into the world of stardom. A world that dazzled at first, but ultimately became both a blessing and a curse, shaping their lives in ways that were as inspiring as they were devastating. Barry Allen Crompton Gibb entered the world on September 1, 1946, in Douglas on the Isle of Man, where music was stitched into the fabric of his childhood from the very start. When the family later moved to Manchester, young Barry began shaping his fascination with writing and performing. But it was in 1958, when the Gibb family immigrated to Australia, that destiny truly began to unfold. In this new country, Barry, alongside Robin and Maurice, turned a childhood passion into a relentless pursuit of greatness, laying the foundation for the sound that would one day conquer the world. Barry's initial foray into music began at a young age. At just 9 years old, he teamed up with Robin and Maurice, along with a few friends, to create a skiffle group they named the Rattlesnakes. Even during these early days, Barry emerged as the creative leader, writing songs and steering the group. When the Rattlesnakes disbanded and rebranded as the Bee Gees, short for Brothers Gibb, they laid the groundwork for one of the most successful bands in music history. The initial years were filled with obstacles. Throughout the 1960s, the Bee Gees worked hard to make a name for themselves, and their breakthrough arrived in 1967 with the release of New York Mining Disaster 1941. This single soared up the charts worldwide, showcasing their mesmerizing harmonies and Barry's unique role as the frontman. This was just the beginning, as they enjoyed a series of hits throughout the late 60s and early 70s. By the mid-1970s, the music landscape was evolving quickly, leaving many artists struggling to adapt. The Bee Gees, however, completely transformed their sound. Barry's falsetto, which he had once played around with, became the focal point of their new musical direction. "You know, I don't really focus on anything. I don't observe myself. I don't read about myself." The timing was impeccable. When the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack dropped in 1977, it not only redefined the Bee Gees but also propelled disco into a worldwide sensation, dominating radio, clubs, and charts across the globe. The effect was monumental. This soundtrack went on to sell over 40 million copies globally, becoming one of the best-selling albums of all time. With his powerful falsetto and songwriting brilliance, Barry became the defining voice of a generation. The Bee Gees were more than just a popular band, they became cultural icons. Their music captured the spirit of the late 1970s, providing a soundtrack for people's lives around the world. In addition to their performances, Barry's legendary songwriting contributions were equally significant. Across the decades, Barry Gibb carved his name into music history, writing or co-writing more than 16 songs that soared to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. A staggering achievement that ranks him among the greatest songwriters of all time. His words and melodies weren't just for the Bee Gees, they became timeless hits for legends like Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton, proving his genius knew no boundaries. The world took notice. In 1994, Barry and his brothers were inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame, a fitting tribute to their unmatched influence. Just 3 years later, they secured their place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And the honors didn't stop there. In 2018, Barry was knighted by Queen Elizabeth herself for his services to music and charity, a crowning moment in a life dedicated to art. Then in 2022, Australia, the country where the Bee Gees' journey truly began, awarded him one of its highest accolades, Honorary Companion of the Order of Australia. For Barry, it wasn't just recognition. It was a full-circle moment, tying his legacy back to the soil where the dream first took root. While the statistics and accolades reveal part of the narrative, they fail to encapsulate the true essence of Barry's ascent. His journey was not solely defined by record sales or chart positions. It was characterized by resilience, adaptability, and a clear vision. He bore the responsibility of leadership within the Bee Gees, steering them through numerous transformations. He was the cohesive force that kept the family act united, even as fame strained their relationships. In this process, Barry's life became a testament to his own accomplishments and the way he uplifted those around him, including his younger brother, Andy. However, this journey to legendary status was not without its shadows. For Barry, success was always intertwined with personal challenges. For Andy, the fame that Barry helped him achieve would turn out to be a double-edged sword. Beneath the glamorous headlines and record-breaking achievements lay a personal narrative of vulnerability, pressure, and heartache that most fans never truly witnessed. Barry faced private struggles. Behind the bright lights of fame and the impressive sales figures, Barry Gibb bore a burden that success could never alleviate. He confronted profound loss, concealed challenges, and the darker aspects of life in the spotlight. While fans admired the confident performer with the soaring falsetto, those closest to Barry understood that he quietly battled issues that shaped him as both an artist and an individual. The most significant burden in Barry's life has been loss. The Bee Gees were never merely a band. They were brothers. Barry, Robin, and Maurice were connected not just by blood, but also by a creative partnership that propelled them from obscurity to global recognition. That bond faced numerous tests, yet it remained the foundation of everything they accomplished. And then came the cruelest twist of all: Barry Gibb became the last Bee Gee left standing. In 2003, Maurice Gibb, Barry's twin in spirit if not in age, died suddenly from complications after surgery. His passing tore a hole through both the family and the music. Maurice had always been the glue, the peacemaker, the bridge whenever tempers flared between Barry and Robin. Without him, there was only silence, a silence Barry admitted he could never truly escape. He described those years as a blur of grief, struggling to find purpose in music without the brother who had been at his side since boyhood. But fate wasn't finished. Less than a decade later, in 2012, Robin Gibb lost his battle with cancer. His haunting voice, his flair for drama, had been the very soul of the Bee Gees' sound. Losing Robin wasn't just losing a brother, it was losing the other half of a creative vision that had shaped more than 50 years of music. From that moment on, Barry walked on stage alone, bearing the weight of a legacy built by 3 voices, now reduced to 1. The spotlight was still his, but the silence behind him was unbearable. For Barry Gibb, being the last man standing was both an honor, and a heartbreak that never healed. Even though he had millions of admirers and a career that few could equal, he acknowledged that there were times when he felt completely alone. After all, family would always come before fame. But Barry's problems didn't start when he was an adult. He had wounds that were hardly spoken, even as a youngster. Barry disclosed in subsequent interviews that as a young boy, he had barely avoided a traumatic event. But even though he was able to get away, the incident had a lasting, subtle effect on him. Barry saw music as more than just a job. It served as a haven and a means of coping with feelings and anxieties that words couldn't always adequately convey. Barry rarely discussed the incident in public, but it was evidence that his path to fame was paved with both opportunity and adversity, which put his fortitude to the test right from the start. While he dealt with his own anguish and the shadows of his early years, he also faced an external struggle. And it was the demands of a field that could be as erratic as it was lucrative. With the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack in the late 1970s, the Bee Gees achieved incredible heights. However, the cultural tide quickly changed. The disco backlash was already underway by 1979. What was previously hailed as revolutionary was suddenly targeted for mockery. The most notorious incident was when thousands of disco records were detonated in the midst of a baseball field during Disco Demolition Night in Chicago in July 1979. The Bee Gees became the unwelcome faces of disco's alleged excess, despite the fact that the stunt was directed broadly at the genre. They were reduced to a caricature of falsetto voices and polyester outfits almost immediately. It was a crushing blow for Berry, who had always taken the greatest delight in his songwriting. He battled the frustration of being limited to a single genre behind the scenes. Long before disco, and long after, the Bee Gees would continue to write popular tunes. However, they were abruptly labeled as fad remnants in the public eye. Invitations to important events stopped coming in, radio airplay decreased, and record sales declined. They were now viewed as outsiders by the business that had formerly celebrated them as icons. Years later, Berry acknowledged that this time challenged his confidence in both his abilities and his profession. He wondered if the Bee Gees would ever be seen outside of disco balls. But he was naturally resilient. Despite those challenging years, Berry remained a prolific writer, creating successes for other musicians who later achieved chart success of their own. One of his distinguishing qualities was his flexibility, his ability to continue producing even when public opinion shifted. Nevertheless, the pain of rejection following such enormous accomplishment never really went away. It was just another silent weight on his shoulders, another reminder that celebrity could be as short-lived as it was euphoric. Berry had both incredible accomplishment and equally extraordinary adversity throughout his life. Few could imagine what he accomplished. He was regarded as one of the best musicians in history, and he received accolades and international fame. However, the shadows were visible to those who peered more closely. The loss of brothers who had accompanied him everywhere. The personal suffering caused by childhood trauma. The constant pressure to succeed in a field that is quick to praise and criticize its stars. Nevertheless, Berry persisted in moving forward despite everything, bringing into the foreground the memories of the brothers who had supported him and the youngest brother, Andy, whom he had previously mentored. Berry did more than influence Andy's professional path. He unlocked the door that let his light shine. The result was a quick ascent that enthralled followers everywhere. However, Berry would eventually acknowledge that Andy's situation was just as complicated, if not more so, than his own. Because Andy was thrown into the world of fame at a much earlier age than Berry, who was aware of the loneliness that could accompany it. The course he followed, first aided by Berry, would bring him great success but ultimately devastating outcomes. Andy Gibb's quick ascent. Andy Gibb is the youngest of the Gibb children, having been born on March 5, 1958. He was barely 6 months old when he and his family relocated to Australia, where his brothers Maurice, Berry, and Robin would start to forge the legends they would become. It was both motivating and frightening to grow up under the influence of 3 elder brothers who were already pursuing musical careers. But he most admired Berry out of all of them. Berry was more than simply a big brother. He served as a mentor, someone Andy aspired to be like in every way. Andy was already pursuing the same ambition that had motivated his brothers by the time he was a teenager. Andy sought performance on his own, in contrast to the Bee Gees, who had established themselves through harmonies and group songwriting. He developed his voice and stage persona while playing in taverns and clubs in Ibiza and later in Australia. Because he possessed the innate charm that attracted people, he was young, attractive, and captivating. More than that, though, he brought with him the promise of the family name and Berry's advice, which would soon open doors much more expansive than he could have on his own. In 1977, that door opened. I Just Want to Be Your Everything, Andy's first single, was recorded and released with Berry's assistance. Berry's song, which was composed especially for Andy, had the distinctive Gibb sound, but it was unique because it was new. Not only did it do well, but it shot straight to the top of the Billboard Hot 100. Andy went from being the youngest of the Gibb brothers to becoming a pop phenomenon all by himself almost suddenly. There was more success to come. Andy wasn't just a one-hit wonder riding on his brother's fame, as seen by his follow-up single, Love is Thicker Than Water, which also peaked at #1 in early 1978. Another song he co-wrote with Barry, Robin, and Maurice, Shadow Dancing, was released that year and went on to become his third consecutive #1 single. Andy Gibb's achievement of 3 straight chart-topping songs in America at the age of 20 made him the youngest artist in history to do so, solidifying his status as a budding star and his position in music history. But he was more than just a musician. Andy had established himself as a regular on American television by the early 1980s. He co-hosted the well-known music show Solid Gold, where he was a favorite among viewers due to his easy charm, youthful appearance, and smooth voice. He was more than just a vocalist. He was a charismatic television personality who captivated viewers week after week. Andy started to get parts in stage musicals when Hollywood took notice. One of his most notable roles was in Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, where he was a perfect fit due to his combination of youthful exuberance and vocal aptitude. Andy's career appeared to be unstoppable for a while. He had the gift, the good looks, the charisma, and most of all, Barry's backing, who kept writing songs and helping him along the way. Fans loved him, and the media praised him as one of the most promising young talents of the late 1970s. Andy was the dream in many ways. In a few years, he had gone from being unknown to being a global celebrity, accomplishing feats that even the most accomplished musicians could not match. Only jealousy. However, behind the scenes, Andy was starting to encounter difficulties that would put him to the test in ways that fame could never have prepared him for, while the public witnessed a self-assured young star relishing the height of his career. Even though his work was taking off, his personal life was already falling apart in both obvious and subtle ways. As Barry would later acknowledge, Andy's quick ascent came with a fragility that no one could overlook. Andy also suffered heartbreaks, pressure problems, and the battle with internal demons that celebrity appeared only to amplify. A life filled with sadness. Despite his early success, Andy Gibb's personal life was a completely different scenario. Andy was a young guy battling heartbreak, difficult relationships, and struggles that celebrity could only exacerbate, hidden behind the self-assured smile and the flurry of chart-topping hits. Along the way, he experienced both highs that wowed the world and lows that subtly gnawed at him until they became unavoidable. At the age of 18, Andy made his first effort at starting a family. He met Kim Rear, an Australian, while he was residing there, and they were married in July 1976. With Andy's goals and the demands of the music industry already bearing down on him, the marriage was hurried and immature. Andy's career in America was booming by January 1978, when their daughter Peta was born. He was drawn into a life of constant touring, recording, and public appearances rather than embracing parenthood. The strain was too much for the couple to bear. Additionally, Andy and Kim got divorced in 1978, just 2 years after getting married. Emotional wounds were caused by the separation. Andy loved the concept of fatherhood, but the reality was more nuanced. He didn't spend much time with Peta as a child because of distance, notoriety, and his own developing problems. In an effort to provide their baby with a feeling of security, Kim subsequently acknowledged that she shielded her away from the craziness of Andy's lifestyle. Andy felt the weight of the absence. He talked lovingly about Peta a lot. However, his sentiments were always tinged with regret, acknowledging that his decisions had denied him the opportunity to be a part of her life during those early years. In a romance that would turn out to be one of the most significant and terrible periods of his personal life, Andy appeared to find happiness once more by the early 1980s. Actress Victoria Principal, who was already well known for her work on the television show Dallas, met him in 1981. Their connection was immediate, intense, and seemed to give Andy a renewed sense of direction for a while. Because of their obvious chemistry, the two were frequently shown together. Magazines couldn't get enough of the youthful pop singer and the glitzy TV personality, and fans adored the combination. However, the relationship was complex below. Andy was already dealing with substance usage, which conflicted with Victoria's strict lifestyle and emphasis on her job. Andy struggled with forces he couldn't always control while she continued working. And their relationship quickly deteriorated due to the imbalance. Their relationship appeared to be a publicity gimmick to some journalists. Two celebrities at the top of their game. But it was much more than that for Andy. He had fallen deeply in love. And he was distraught when the relationship abruptly terminated in 1982. According to friends and family, Andy never truly bounced back from the separation. Losing Victoria seemed to amplify all of his fears and increase his reliance on illegal drugs as a coping mechanism. Maurice, Robin, and Barry did their best to help him. However, Andy found himself in a vicious cycle that was hard to escape. He was driven deeper into risky behaviors by the heartache, the demands of celebrity, and the emptiness he frequently experienced in his personal life. The statement, "It's all over a woman," may sound weak, but it's actually kind of true. The impact on his health became more apparent. Andy's substance misuse exacerbated his stomach problems and chest pains, which led to several hospital stays in the mid-1980s. Despite his attempts to make a musical and emotional return, years of strain were already taking a toll on his health. Andy's boyish charm was overshadowed by the heaviness of someone who had lived too quickly by the time he was in his late 20s. Andy started complaining of excruciating chest problems at his Oxford, England, home in March 1988. The damage was already done when he was taken to the hospital. And Andy Gibb unfortunately died on March 10, 1988, only 5 days after turning 30. Myocarditis, or inflammation of the heart muscle, was the official cause. However, medical professionals noted that his body had been gravely weakened by years of substance misuse. Fans worldwide were taken aback by the revelation. Andy had appeared endlessly young to many. The attractive Gibb brother who personified success and charm. His untimely passing served as a sobering reminder of both the negative aspects of celebrity and the consequences of unsolved personal issues. Andy was buried at Los Angeles's Forest Lawn Memorial Park, which is also home to the tombs of innumerable other entertainment icons. Fans, musicians, and co-workers who had collaborated with him began to pay their respects in the days and weeks that followed. For Barry, Robin, and Maurice, his music, particularly those first few singles that shattered records, became a constant reminder of the brilliance that was gone far too young. There was more to Andy's passing than the loss of a sibling. For their youngest brother, it was the end of a dream they had all shared. Additionally, Andy's story would serve as one of Barry's most profound sources of introspection. Because Barry bore the burden of witnessing his brother's downfall as much as he rejoiced in his ascent. Andy's hardships were a tragedy in his family. And for years to come, Barry would wonder what more could have been done. The real story of Andy Gibb. Hit songs, glitzy appearances, and headlines were frequently used to describe Andy Gibb's life. But all of that was far from the truth of who he was. A young man struggling with anxieties, stress, and a vulnerability that fame only exacerbated was hidden beneath the facade of a pop star. Andy was acutely conscious of his older brother's heritage from the start. It was intimidating to enter into the shadow of Barry, Robin, and Maurice, who had already made the Bee Gees one of the most successful bands in the world. Even though Andy had great musical talent, he always questioned if he was really up to par. Andy relied significantly on his brothers, especially Barry, for artistic direction, in contrast to the Bee Gees, who established their reputations through writing and producing. Even with singles that made him a household name, Andy's biggest issue remained insecurity. His modest dread that he wasn't standing on his own but rather because to his brother's efforts was strengthened by fame. He was concerned that his popularity was borrowed rather than earned, and he doubted his ability to write songs. He never got over this insecurity. Despite the fact that his admirers loved him, Andy frequently found it difficult to consider himself as superior to the younger Gibb brother and was always comparing his accomplishments to the bar set by three of the greatest artists in history. Andy's worries were not silenced by fame. It increased their volume. His use of illegal narcotics, which he started in his late teens and intensified during his years in the spotlight, increased as his career took off. It initially appeared to be a means of meeting the demands of public appearances, recording, and touring. It quickly turned into something more sinister, a crutch he used to get away from emotions he couldn't get rid of. By the beginning of the 1980s, Andy's addiction was widely known. It harmed his relationships, interfered with his work, and damaged his health. Fans as well as friends and family could see the toll it was taking. But it was really hard to break loose. In a single candid interview on Top Morning the United States, Andy himself admitted the intensity of his warfare, announcing, "I've been to hell and again. I suppose literally, I had a very terrible fearful breakdown. I had the whole thing I wanted, and I just blew all of it up." Those phrases captured the turmoil he lived with daily, swinging between moments of hope and intervals of relapse that seemed impossible to triumph over. Beyond the dependency lay something even greater painful, an experience of emotional isolation that Andy carried with him. In spite of the adoration of millions, he frequently felt alone. Repute in preference to curing his loneliness most effective regarded to spotlight it. The regular attention, the strain to carry out, and the need to live up to an image created a disconnect among who he was in public and the way he felt in personal. He battled depression and tension, situations that have been less openly discussed within the 80s than there today. This meant struggling quietly, covering his pain with appeal and showmanship on stage, best to return to non-public struggles whilst the lights went down. He changed into gentle, sensitive, and deeply affectionate, however also a person who felt matters too intensely, who may be crushed by way of the very weight of his own emotions. Tons of Andy's tale has been pieced collectively through interviews, reminiscences, and later through the biography Arrow Through the Heart by Matthew Hild. The ebook sheds mild at the untold elements of Andy's lifestyles, portray a portrait of a man cherished by many however not able to find peace inside himself. He was regularly defined as cherished however misplaced. A young superstar who appeared to have the whole lot yet was ate up via feelings of inadequacy and a warfare to cope with Repute's relentless demands. For Barry, Andy's struggles have been now not remote. They had been deeply personal. Because the eldest brother, he had constantly felt an obligation for Andy, guiding him into the industry and supporting him discover his voice. However, looking Andy spiral into dependency and heartbreak left Barry feeling helpless. He later admitted his regret, saying absolutely, "I'd instead have my brother's back and no hits at all." It changed into a declaration that carried not handiest grief for Andy, however for Robin and Maurice as well, whose deaths would go away Barry, the closing surviving Gibb. Barry spoke overtly about the ache of seeing Andy's potential cut brief, of wishing he should have achieved extra to store him. For a person who had spent his life leading his family through the highs and lows of repute, Andy's story remained a wound that by no means absolutely healed. In interviews, Barry frequently pondered on how fragile Andy was, describing him as a soul who turned into too sensitive for this global. It changed into each a tribute and a lament, a reputation that Andy's items came with vulnerabilities that reputation handiest sharpened. What do you reflect on consideration on Andy Gibb's struggles? Let us realize within the feedback segment under. In case you loved this video, consider to click on the following video in your display, like this video, and join our channel for extra updates.